All right, welcome. This is Lucid Butterfly. This is another manifestation lecture. Today, let's talk about limiting beliefs and blockers. There is sometimes people talk about these in videos, and I think a lot of it is understood. Like, when it comes to limiting beliefs, say you're trying to manifest, having a bunch of money, right? You can look at your bank account and say, oh, I have $1 million in here. But if you still feel broke and you don't feel like you're good at your job and you don't feel like, you can buy anything, that's a limiting belief. But that's an obvious example. It's kind of a weak one, but it's, the typical one. But what I want to talk about today is hidden or disguised assumptions. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a limiting belief because it's not limiting in the terms of, identity or self-concept. A lot of people like to talk about. But I want to talk about a limiting belief in terms of, we'll call it a limiting assumption. Let's say that a lot of people talk about these limiting beliefs, but I want to take it into a different direction that not a lot of people talk about, but it's very important because a lot of people get stuck and they say, why is my manifestation not working? I got some movement, blah, 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 what's going on with this? And a lot of times I've noticed it has to do with these limiting assumptions. So let's talk about an example. Let's say that you got invited to a wedding. That was great. And you got into an argument with one of the bride or groom in the wedding and you got disinvited or something. And let's say your manifestation is you want to get re-invited to this wedding. Okay, so the manifestation is getting re-invited to the wedding. And let's say that you do a bunch of assumption work, sats every night. You've been doing it for months or something. And let's say you've been visualizing, you've been doing it so well, you're not checking the 3D, you're not sticking to the old story. You have this new story in your head. You've been faithful to it. You've been persisting. Let's say you've done all that stuff, right? But you might be wondering, why didn't this manifestation come through? Why is it taking so long? I did everything right, And let's say you got some movement, all right? Here's what I want to talk about because not a lot of people realize this, but it is possible to get movement that is echoing a limiting assumption. So let's say that you have this assumption that the groom doesn't like you, okay? But you're assuming that you're going to the wedding, right? You're saying, oh, I'm re-invited to the wedding. That's the new story. You might get movement, and that might come in the way of the groom reaching out and saying, I need to, we're getting your name off the list, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's some negative movement, how sometimes things seem negative before things manifest, but that's still movement, right? So say, you verified that this is movement, it's good, they reached out to you, there's movement in this way. Wasn't exactly what you want, but it's still movement. You might get excited and then nothing might happen. What's important to understand is you might have a limiting assumption in your head that the groom doesn't like you. So how can you get invited to the wedding and the groom not like you? How can you get invited back and the groom not like you? And let's say you don't care that the groom doesn't like you, but you fully believe you're getting invited back to the wedding. Here's the interesting thing. The groom not liking you is contradictory to the fact that you are assuming that you got re-invited to the wedding. So you might think, oh, well, I'm manifesting this. I lived in the end all the time. That should override everything. Yes and no. The reason for that is there are two contradictory beliefs. So which one would happen? That nothing happens because they're contradicting each other. So to make it kind of more visual, if you go to buy a car and you say I want the red one, and and my wife said I want the white one, the owner's going to be the car salesman's not going to do anything. He doesn't have a clear answer. We didn't give him a clear answer unless we both talk together and say actually we're going to get the orange. Okay, well that's a clear answer. So going back to the wedding analogy, you might not care about the limiting assumption and you might not think it plays a part, but it does. So when you get movement or something, it's common to see from my experience the movement that you get when assuming echoing a limiting assumption. So that limiting assumption might be the groom reaches out, like I said earlier, and says, in an annoying tone, we're getting you off the list, blah, blah, blah. Here's some coordination with getting you off the list. And then nothing will happen after that. And that's because what's happening is you broke through the 3D with your assumption of getting reinvited, but you have that negative assumption, that limiting assumption of the groom doesn't like me. So now that I made that point clear, I think a lot of people have this issue more than they realize, because it doesn't have to be upsetting you to be a limiting assumption, like a lot of people believe. Like a lot of times people diagnose a limiting belief by how it makes them feel. Oh, I don't have a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. But then if you say I have a bunch of money, but then you just don't feel like you can earn a lot of money, that's obvious, because you feel, it might be obvious because you feel like, oh, I don't feel like I can make a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. It's easy to diagnose. But sometimes limiting assumptions are not easy to diagnose. Like the groom not liking you scenario. Maybe you don't care that the groom doesn't like you, but you just want to go see a bunch of people or whatever. So that's basically what I'm trying to get at with this lecture, is that a limiting assumption doesn't have to be obvious, and sometimes it can be hidden. So remember, while you're doing your manifestation work, think to yourself, what are all the things you believe about this situation? Is there anything that you believe, even if it doesn't bother you, that might contradict it? Those are the things you want to go after. So I hope this makes sense. That's something that I realize is blocking a lot of people. I think this is a big thing. Not a lot of people are talking about it, but I think this is huge. A limiting belief doesn't have to be something that bothers you. In fact, I would categorize them into two separate categories. I would say a limiting belief might be, even though the nomenclature isn't established, I would say that a limiting belief is, I'm establishing it. A limiting belief would be more identity based, while a limiting assumption, or let's say contradictory assumption, we'll call them contradictory assumptions. A limiting belief goes for a negative identity trait. A contradictory assumption directly contradicts a manifestation, thus blocking it. Your subconscious doesn't understand logic the way that we do. It understands feeling and what we impress upon it. So, keep that in mind. If any of you guys need help on this stuff, diagnosing what the issue is, what potential limiting limiting beliefs or contradictory assumptions you have, just let me know. But so that's it for today's lecture. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you guys have any questions. All right, have a good night.